They gave him a folded flag and a handshake, and then they showed him the door. That was how Henry Caldwell's 31 years ended. Not with a ceremony worth remembering. Not with the kind of send-off you'd expect for a man who'd served in places most Americans couldn't find on a map. Just a colonel he barely knew, a conference room that smelled like burnt coffee, and a manila envelope containing paperwork that said, in the careful language of institutions, that he was no longer needed. Henry was 63 years old. He had a bad knee, a hearing aid in his left ear, and a Belgian Malinois named Corporal, who had been his shadow for the past 7 years. He also had, as of that Thursday afternoon in March, nowhere to go. The apartment in Fayetteville had been sublet to a young sergeant's family while Henry was on his last deployment. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. A lot of things were supposed to be temporary. When he came back, the sergeant's wife was pregnant with their second child, and the lease had been transferred to her name, quietly and without anyone thinking to tell Henry. The landlord shrugged, said there was nothing he could do, said the unit wouldn't be available again until September at the earliest. September was 6 months away. Henry stood on the sidewalk outside the building, with Corporal sitting at his left heel, both of them watching traffic move past on Cumberland Avenue. He had his military-issue duffel, his dog's gear, and $4,200 in a checking account that would need to stretch until his pension paperwork cleared, which the VA had told him could take anywhere from 8 to 14 weeks. "Well," he said. Corporal looked up at him. The dog's amber eyes held that particular kind of patience that Henry had come to think of as the Malinois version of optimism. Not cheerful exactly, but unafraid. Whatever comes next, those eyes said, we handle it together. Henry had bought a used truck the previous fall, a 2009 Ford F-250 that burned oil and had a rear window that wouldn't seal completely. It was parked 2 blocks over. He walked to it, loaded his duffel into the bed, let Corporal jump up onto the passenger seat, and sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine. He was not a man who cried easily. The Army had not made him that way, and honestly, the man he'd been before the Army hadn't been built for it either. His father, a Korean War-era mechanic from rural Tennessee, had used the word feelings, the way other people use the word weather. Something that happened, something you acknowledged, and then something you walked through on your way to the next thing. Henry had absorbed that lesson early and carried it without much examination for 6 decades. But sitting in that truck on a Thursday afternoon in March, with Corporal's warm weight pressed against his right side, and the flag folded in a triangle on the dashboard, Henry felt something move through his chest that he didn't have a name for. Not grief exactly. Not anger. Something older. Something that tasted like the particular loneliness of being in a room full of people who have already decided you are finished. He started the engine. He drove west, because west was the direction with the fewest memories. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. He stopped in Cookeville the first night, slept in the truck in a Walmart parking lot with Corporal curled across his legs. The dog was 65 pounds and had no concept of personal space, which Henry had long since stopped trying to correct. In cold weather, Corporal's body heat was worth more than any blanket. The second day took him through Nashville and across the state line into Kentucky. He wasn't following a route exactly. He had a vague idea about his cousin Burl's property up near Bowling Green. Burl had mentioned once, years ago at a family reunion, that he had extra land and an old guest cabin that sat empty most of the year. Henry hadn't spoken to Burl in almost a decade. He wasn't sure the invitation still stood. He wasn't sure it had ever been a real invitation, rather than the kind of thing people say at family reunions, when they're on their 3rd beer and feeling generous. He called anyway. Burl answered on the 4th ring, sounding surprised but not unwelcoming. There was some catching up. There were condolences about Henry's retirement that were phrased carefully, the way people phrase things when they can't tell whether the news is good or bad. And then Henry asked about the cabin. There was a pause. Henry, Burl said, I sold that property 2 years back. The whole back 40. Okay, you need a place to stay? I'm handling it. He wasn't handling it. But he wasn't ready to say so. And Burl, to his credit, seemed to understand that. And they ended the call with a promise to get together soon that both of them knew was approximate. Henry sat in a Cracker Barrel parking lot in Bowling Green and looked at his phone. He had a Google Maps tab open and another tab with a list of VA transition resources that a counselor had emailed him 3 weeks ago, before the paperwork had even started. The VA resources were mostly phone numbers for hotlines and links to PDF documents. He closed the tab. He opened a different search. Typed, cheap land to rent Appalachian region dog-friendly. The results were what you'd expect. Ads. Listings that sounded promising until you read the fine print. One website called backwoodslistings.com had a section called Primitive Properties. Unimproved land and structures, often seller-financed, often cash-only, often involving some combination of the words as is and no utilities. He scrolled. Most of it was priced beyond what he had liquid. Some of it was in places so remote the listings mentioned the nearest road as a selling point, and then he saw it. Eastern Kentucky, Harlan County. 1-room hunting cabin on 3 acres, creek access, no electric, hand pump water, good roof, 8 Almamo or purchase outright for $400. Serious inquiries only, no druggies. Veterans welcome. Henry read it twice. He read it a third time. $8 a month. He called the number listed. A woman named Loretta picked up. Not the Loretta from the list. This was someone else entirely. An older woman in her 70s, who explained that the property had belonged to her late husband's family going back to the 1940s. Her son had wanted her to sell it to a developer. She had told the son where he could put that idea. The listing was real. The price was real. She'd had 3 calls already that week, she said, but 2 of them had been from people who started talking about what they'd change before they'd even asked about the condition of the roof. What do you want to know? She asked Henry. Is the roof solid? A pause. It held through last winter. Does it flood? 3 acres backs up to Clover Branch Creek. It runs fast in spring. The cabin sits on a rise. Your feet'll stay dry. Can I bring my dog? Is he well behaved? Henry looked at Corporal, who was sitting in the passenger seat, staring at a French fry wrapper on the floor of the truck with the intense focus of a trained professional. Yes, ma'am, Henry said. He drove to Harlan County the next morning. The road in wasn't a road exactly. It was more of an intention. 2 tire tracks through second-growth forest, running about a 1/4 mile back from the county route, crossing a wooden plank bridge over a creek that was maybe 8 feet wide and running clear over gray limestone. The trees were still bare. It was only mid-March, and through them Henry could see the shape of the cabin before he reached it. He stopped the truck before he got there. Sat with the engine idling. Corporal pressed his nose against the windshield glass. The cabin was small. 1 room, from the look of it, maybe 16 by 20 feet. The walls were vertical board and batten, weathered to a silver gray that blended into the tree line, the way old things sometimes blend back into the land they came from. The porch roof sagged on the left side where a support post had settled into the ground at an angle. The front steps were solid, though, concrete, poured sometime after the wood originals had given up. Henry got out. The air smelled like creek water and old leaves and a particular cold that still had winter in it. Corporal jumped down and immediately put his nose to the ground, reading whatever story the previous occupants had left in the dirt. His tail was up. His ears were forward. Henry walked to the porch. The door was unlocked, as Loretta had said it would be. He pushed it open. Inside, a single room with a plank floor, a wood stove in the corner, a sleeping loft accessible by a fixed ladder, 1 window facing the creek, 1 window facing what had once been a small clearing but was now reclaimed by sumac and young poplar, a hand pump in the corner over a basin, connected to a pipe that ran down through the floor to the well. No electricity, no insulation that he could see, gaps between some of the boards where the wall met the floor. Cold. It was very cold inside. Corporal walked in past Henry's legs, crossed the room, sniffed the base of the wood stove, and sat down in front of it with an air of decision. Henry stood in the doorway and looked at all of it. In 31 years, he had slept in places that made this look like the Marriott. He had spent 6 weeks in a fire base in Kunar province, where the roof was corrugated metal that sounded like a snare drum in the rain, and the wind came off the Hindu Kush, cold enough to make your teeth ache. He had served a rotation in the Horn of Africa, in a plywood and sandbag structure that the official documentation called a temporary installation, and that the men who lived in it called various other things. He knew how to take a structure that someone had decided was done and find what it still had left to give. He called Loretta. "I'll take it," he said. He drove back out to the county route and found a Dollar General 7 miles up the road. He bought steel wool, a box of roofing nails, a tube of waterproof caulk, and a bag of dog food. He stopped at a hardware store in Cumberland and bought a used splitting maul from the rack of used tools by the door, 2 boxes of fire starter bricks, and a headlamp. The man at the counter looked at Henry's purchases and didn't ask any questions, which Henry appreciated. The first week was the hardest, not because of the work. Henry was not afraid of work. It was the silence that took some getting used to. The specific silence of Harlan County in late winter, which was not actually silence at all, but a layered collection of sounds that his ears, tuned for 30 years to the frequency of operations, kept mistranslating as threat. The creek, the wind through the bare trees. A woodpecker somewhere on the ridge that started every morning around 6 a.m. with the manic focus of a professional. His nervous system kept flagging these sounds, and his brain kept standing them down, and, eventually, the two reached an accommodation. The way things do when there's no alternative. Corporal had no such adjustment period. Corporal took to the woods the way he'd been born to them. He spent the first morning doing wide perimeter sweeps in the clearing, cataloging every scent post, marking his opinions about the territory. By the second evening, he had identified a groundhog burrow under the old woodpile and had established a vigil in front of it, with the patience of a creature who has both all the time in the world and absolutely no doubt about the outcome. Henry started with the gaps in the wall. He mixed the caulk with a strip of old t-shirt cut into lengths and worked his way around the baseboards, pushing the material into every crack he could find. He plugged the worst of the gaps with pieces of fiberglass insulation he'd pulled from an old army surplus sleeping mat. He used the steel wool to block holes in the corner where the plank floor met the stone foundation, the kind of holes that small animals treat as standing invitations. Then he turned to the wood stove. The stovepipe was original, which meant it was almost certainly dangerous. He spent 2 days taking it apart section by section, cleaning decades of creosote from the interior with a wire brush he'd bought in Cumberland, inspecting each joint, replacing 2 sections that had rusted through, with lengths he found at a salvage yard run out of a converted barn 12 miles up the road. The salvage yard man's name was Doyle, and he had a daughter in the Navy and spent 20 minutes showing Henry photos on his phone before getting to business. Henry didn't mind. He had learned a long time ago that people who have someone in the service want to talk about it, the way people with a new grandchild want to talk about that. Not because they expect you to match their feelings, but because saying it out loud makes it more real, makes the person they love feel closer to home. The stove, when he lit it that first time with a proper draw, heated the cabin from 40 degrees to nearly 60 in under an hour. Henry sat on the floor with his back against the wall, Corporal's head in his lap, and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't sure what to call it. Quiet, maybe, not the absence of noise. The other kind of quiet, the kind that lives inside you when you stop bracing for whatever comes next. April came, and with it the creek rose 2 feet and ran white over the limestone for 10 days straight. The cabin stayed dry. The rise Loretta had mentioned was real. A gentle elevation Henry had initially thought was just uneven ground, but turned out to be a deliberate choice made by whoever had built the place, someone who had understood water the way you only understand it when you live close to it. He started sleeping better. Not well. He hadn't slept well since his first deployment, and at 63 he had no particular expectation that this would change. But better. He woke at the same hour. Every morning, 4:30, the habit of decades. And instead of lying still and listening to an apartment building breathe around him, he could hear the creek and the birds beginning their early business in the trees. He would lie still for a few minutes with Corporal's weight against his legs and look at the square of sky, visible through the loft window, and think about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of practice. He began fixing what he hadn't initially planned to fix, the porch support post. He pulled it, dug out the rotted base, set a concrete footing, and reset the post plumb. He poured the concrete himself, mixed in a wheelbarrow he borrowed from Doyle at the salvage yard, and returned the same afternoon. The sagging porch roof leveled out within a week. As the post took weight, the rafters, slowly straightening the way structures do when you give them back their geometry. The loft needed new treads on the ladder. 3 of the original rungs were cracked through. He cut new ones from a piece of black locust he found in the woodpile, already seasoned, harder than most steel, and resistant to everything. Fitted them and pinned them and felt unreasonably satisfied with the result. He started clearing the sumac from the old clearing south of the cabin. This was not strictly necessary. He told himself it was for Corporal's benefit, which was partially true. But there was something in the act of reclaiming ground that Henry recognized from other contexts, other work. The feeling of arriving somewhere that has been neglected and deciding that it matters, that someone is going to pay attention to it now. The sumac came out in long fibrous roots that put up resistance before releasing. He worked methodically, row by row, the way he'd been trained to clear other kinds of terrain. By the end of April, the clearing was open, 50 feet by 30, the soil dark and workable underneath. He planted a kitchen garden. He hadn't grown anything in 30 years. The last time had been in his mother's backyard in Tennessee when he was a boy, helping her stake tomato plants in the July heat while his father sat on the porch with the radio. He bought seed packets at the Dollar General. Beans, squash, 2 kinds of tomatoes, and a bag of compost from a farm supply in Harlan proper. He wasn't sure what he was doing exactly, but the beans didn't seem to know that, and they came up anyway, pale green and determined, in the first week of May. Corporal took to guarding the garden, with the same focused intensity he applied to the groundhog burrow. Though his enforcement strategies were less effective against birds, Henry watched him one morning, standing motionless at the edge of the bean rows, tracking a robin with his eyes, while the robin went completely about its business. The Malinois had a particular stillness when he was concentrating. Not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of attention. The whole body gathered and quiet and present. It was the quality Henry had valued most in him during their time working together in the military, that ability to be completely, undistractedly here. He thought about that word for a while. Here, 31 years had taken him to 23 countries. He had been everywhere except here, wherever here happened to be. Not Harlan County specifically, just present, just existing in the place where he actually was, without the pull of the next assignment, the next rotation, the next set of orders waiting in some inbox somewhere that needed his attention. He sat on the repaired porch in the evenings and watched the creek and thought about that. In early June, a man came down the track road. Henry heard the truck before he saw it. A diesel, moving slow, not familiar. Corporal stood up from the porch boards and turned toward the sound without barking, head tilted, reading the information. Henry stood too. The truck was an older Chevy, early 2000s, and the man who got out was about Henry's age, maybe a few years younger, moving the way men move, when something in their back or their knee has an opinion about the weather. He wore a John Deere hat and a canvas jacket, and he stood by his truck and looked at the cabin for a long moment before speaking. "You the fella renting Loretta's place?" "That's right," Henry said. The man nodded. "I'm her neighbor, 2 parcels over. Name's Aubrey Hutchins. She mentioned she'd rented to a veteran." He paused. I served. Army, 82nd Airborne. Did too in Vietnam. Henry felt the specific shift in the air that happens when two people with that kind of history recognize each other. Not warmth exactly. Not at first. It was more precise than warmth. More like the moment when two people speaking the same language find each other in a room full of people who don't. Marines, Henry said. 31 years. Aubrey nodded again. He looked at Corporal, who had come down from the porch and was standing at Henry's left side, relaxed but attentive. That a Malinois? He is. I had a shepherd 30 years ago. He didn't say anything else about that, and Henry didn't ask. Some things you mention and leave, the way you leave a marker on a trail. Aubrey came up to the porch. They sat, and Aubrey produced a folded paper bag from his jacket pocket that turned out to contain 2 cans of Ale 81, the regional ginger ale, cold from what had presumably been a cooler in his truck. Henry accepted one. They drank. Corporal lay between them with his chin on his paws. They talked for 2 hours, not about anything dramatic. About the property, the history of it, how the original cabin had been built by a coal miner named Percival Holt in 1923, who had needed a hunting place that was his own and not company-owned land. About the creek and where the best fishing pools were. About Aubrey's property, the 60 acres he'd bought in 1989, with every dollar he had after Vietnam, and some he'd borrowed, and hadn't yet forgiven himself for borrowing. About his wife Darlene, who had been gone 4 years now. About his son in Lexington, who called on Sundays and visited twice a year, and meant well, and understood almost nothing about why Aubrey still lived out here in Harlan County, when he could sell and move to the city and make things easier. Henry listened more than he talked, the way he'd learned to in 30 years of situations where information was more valuable than opinion. When Aubrey got up to leave, he stood by his truck and looked back at the cabin. You've done good work on it, he said. Lorette'll be glad to see what you've done with the porch. It needed doing, Henry said. Aubrey reached into his truck cab and brought out a paper bag, the grocery kind. Set it on the tailgate. Darlene always kept a kitchen garden, he said. I still plant every year because I don't know how to stop. More squash than I know what to do with. He drove back up the track road. Henry looked in the bag. 8 pounds of yellow squash, a bunch of dried herbs, and a mason jar of what turned out to be the best pickled beans he'd had since his grandmother's kitchen in eastern Tennessee. He stood in the clearing for a while after the truck disappeared. Corporal pressed against his leg. July brought heat. The hollow held it, the creek trees blocking the breeze so that the afternoons felt thick and close. Henry rigged a canvas shade off the south side of the cabin, using a pole and some paracord. The way you do when you've spent time in hot climates, and your body knows the vocabulary of improvised shade. He worked mornings and read in the afternoons library books mostly, history and biography, the kind of reading he'd never had time for during his years of service. He called his daughter in August. Her name was Patrice. She lived in Charlottesville, Virginia with her husband, and 2 kids Henry had met 3 times. The relationship had a particular shape. Not broken, not close, more like a structure that had been built slightly out of square, and no one had ever gotten around to correcting the angle. Henry had been gone for most of her childhood, not from any failure of love, but from the specific way military service arranges a man's life so that it mostly happens somewhere else. Dad, she said when she heard his voice. Where are you? He told her. There was a pause. Harlan County? Is that in Kentucky? Eastern Kentucky. It's beautiful country. Another pause. He could hear one of the grandchildren in the background, the high, bright sound of someone young being delighted by something. Are you okay? I'm better than I've been in a long time, he said, and meant it, and felt strange meaning it, because the words were accurate, but the situation they described. Alone, in a rented hunting cabin in Harlan County, Kentucky, with a dog and a repaired porch and a kitchen garden, was not the situation he would have designed if someone had handed him a plan. I want to come see you, Patrice said. Anytime, he said. I mean it. So do I, he said. And then, because something in her voice made him want to be more precise. Patrice, I know I wasn't always where you needed me to be. I've been sitting out here thinking about that a fair amount. A long silence, not empty. The kind of silence that has weight. I know you're thinking about it, she said. I know. After the call, Henry sat on the porch until the light left the hollow entirely. Corporal lay at his feet. The creek talked to itself over the limestone, and a whip-poor will started up somewhere in the trees across the water. That insistent binary call that carries in summer evenings farther than you'd think possible. He thought about what it meant to be useful. 31 years had given him a very specific definition of that word. Useful meant operational. Useful meant a task, a team, a mission, with defined objectives and measurable outcomes. That version of useful had ended in a conference room in Fayetteville in March, and he had not yet replaced it with anything, but he had fixed a porch. He had cleared a half-acre of sumac and planted beans that were now producing more beans than he could eat alone. He had restored a stovepipe that a bad winter might have turned dangerous. He had sat on this porch for 2 hours with a Vietnam veteran named Aubrey Hutchins and done nothing more or less than listen. And afterward Aubrey had brought him squash and pickled beans and had looked at the cabin with an expression Henry recognized as something adjacent to peace. Maybe useful could be smaller than he'd thought. Maybe useful could look like this. A lamp in a hollow, throwing light that wasn't meant for any particular purpose except to be on. In September, Aubrey brought a man named Clifton Dewayne, who had done 2 tours in Iraq with the Guard and come back to Harlan County in 2006 and hadn't quite found his way back to himself since. Clifton was 44, lean in the way that happens when a person has been anxious for a long time, with eyes that checked exits as a matter of habit. He sat on Henry's porch and didn't say much. Corporal, who had an instinct for people that Henry had long since stopped trying to explain scientifically, went directly to Clifton and put his head on the man's knee, which Clifton received with an expression that passed quickly across his face and then was gone. Aubrey and Henry talked about the cabin, about the garden, about the changes in the ridgeline since the timber company had come through in the 1990s. Clifton listened, drank coffee. Gradually, his shoulders came down about an inch. Before they left, Clifton stopped on the porch steps and looked back at the cabin. "You built all this yourself?" he asked. "It was already built," Henry said. "I just reminded it of what it was supposed to be." Clifton nodded slowly. Something in his face was different from when he'd arrived. Henry couldn't have said precisely what. They came back the following Saturday, and the Saturday after that. Sometimes Aubrey brought other men, a Gulf War veteran from over in Leslie County, a former Navy corpsman who had driven back to eastern Kentucky after 20 years in San Diego and still seemed slightly disoriented by the quiet. Henry made coffee. Corporal made his rounds. The porch held the weight of them without complaint. No one organized it. No one called it anything. It was just a porch and a cabin and a dog who seemed to know instinctively which man needed his attention most on any given morning, and an old Marine who had learned, over the course of a long summer in a hollow in Harlan County, that the most useful thing he possessed was not any skill in his hands or any knowledge in his head. It was the fact that he was here, present, unmoving, a fixed point in a county full of men who had spent years in motion and come back to find that stillness was harder than anything they'd faced in the field. Loretta came to see the place in October, driven by her son who waited in the truck while she walked the property with Henry. She was small and deliberate in her movements, wearing rubber boots and a rain jacket the color of old pine. She walked the porch, tested the post, looked at the new loft treads. She stood at the edge of the cleared garden and looked at the late squash still on the vine. "Percival would have liked you," she said. "The man who built this place. He was an army man too. First war. He came back to this county and built this cabin and sat in it for about 2 years before he could figure out what to do next." She looked at the cabin. "Then he figured it out. Took him 2 years." Henry didn't say anything. "How long has it been for you?" she asked. 7 months, he said. She nodded. You're ahead of schedule, she said, and walked back toward the truck. Her son helped her in and rolled down his window. He looked at Henry with an expression that was slightly reluctant, like a man who has been wrong about something and is getting around to admitting it. She told me this place wasn't worth fixing, he said. Told me I should let her sell it to you as is and be done with it. I thought she was being sentimental. Henry didn't respond to that directly. It's a good piece of ground, he said. The son looked at the cabin again. Yeah, he said. I'm starting to see that. Patrice came in November, with her husband Ted and both kids, a boy named Marcus, 7, and a girl named Lily, who was 5 and had decided within approximately 30 seconds of meeting Corporal that he was her personal property. Corporal accepted this with the equanimity of a creature who has survived much stranger assignments. They stayed 3 days. They slept in sleeping bags in the loft, which the kids treated as the greatest accommodation they had ever been offered. Patrice cooked on the camp stove Henry had acquired in September, and they ate on the porch in the cold, wrapped in jackets. And at some point on the second evening, Ted said something that surprised Henry. I didn't understand why you came here, Ted said. He was a quiet man, careful, an engineer, the kind of person who needed to understand the structure of something before he could trust it. I thought it seemed like, I don't know, giving up, almost. Henry looked at him. It's not that, Ted said. I see that now. Henry thought about how to explain it. He looked at the creek. Dark now in the November evening, audible but not visible. He thought about a conference room in Fayetteville and a folded flag. He thought about Aubrey's shoulders going loose as he talked about Darlene. He thought about Clifton Duane's face when Corporal put his head on his knee. I thought I was coming here to disappear, Henry said finally. Turns out I was coming here to show up. Lily had fallen asleep against Corporal's flank, her small face completely trusting, one hand wrapped in the dog's fur. Corporal lay perfectly still. Patrice looked at her daughter, and then at her father, and for a moment, her expression held everything that the preceding 31 years had made difficult to say between them. The absences, the missed things, the particular silence of growing up with a parent who was always somewhere else. All of that was still true. It didn't unhappen. But there was this too. This porch, this cold evening, this creek they could hear but not see. This man who had driven west and then turned around and found something he hadn't known. He was looking for in a hollow in eastern Kentucky, in a rented cabin that had cost him $8 a month, and he thought he knew about what his life was supposed to look like. She reached over and took his hand. He let her. Corporal didn't move. The creek ran. The first stars were visible above the ridgeline, sharp and near in the cold November air, and on a porch that one old man and one good dog had brought back from the edge of ruin, something quiet was being repaired. Not perfectly, but beautifully.